Oh my god, I'm so sorry. So, I might be notorious for taking long pauses when it comes to putting out a good video, but let's face it, at least it's not as long of a pause as it took for Goichi Suda to finally get back into the director's chair.
It's called fashionably late fuckface.
Yes, in case you missed it, one of video gaming's unsung heroes, Travis Touchdown, is back, and he's coming to the Nintendo Switch, a console recently crowned by yours truly as the best thing since barbecue pizza, so it's only fitting that Suda's return to glory as the director will be on said platform. Travis Strikes Again was announced way back earlier in the year as the next entry in a storied yet almost decade-long dormant No More Heroes franchise, which follows the escapades of gung-ho otaku Travis Touchdown. The games are easily the most popular ones to come out of Grasshopper manufacture, and definitely the most widely known games made by the Japanese punk rock developer Suda51. So its return is of no surprise, it's going to happen at some point. But I think the most important thing to delineate about this game's existence is less so that it's a thing being made, and more so the circumstances of it existing. I brought this back up in my top 10 of 2016 video where I listed Let It Die as one of my favorite games of said year, namely that while I highly enjoyed the game, I feel complicit in perpetuating cycle of inflating Suda's value when it comes to game development. See, I enjoy Suda's games, in fact I own pretty much every one of them where it counts, and in some cases I even double dip on them. But there's a paradigm shift within the Maniac Minds output that can consistently be traced back to the No More Heroes franchise as a whole. That's namely the ever so subtle fact that Suda has not been a game director since the very original No More Heroes. And I think this is something that would be fairly easy for the attentive player to kind of tell if you've ever followed the output that's been credited to him. So, in anticipation for Travis Strikes Again, we're going to take a thorough look throughout his history in games, but more specifically the subtle elements that actually made No More Heroes such a storied title, and why his return for Travis Strikes Again has me more excited than ever. If nothing else, if you've never experienced the franchise before, maybe you'll finally come to learn why people hold No More Heroes in such high regard, and why Suda's return to it has people ever so excited. Before I go into detail on the game, I think it's important to draw certain lines in the sand. I've made one video on a Suda51 game already, which was Killer 7. To this very date, it still remains one of my personal favorite videos on this channel, and I recommend giving it a watch if you haven't. I argued back then that no game Suda will make can ever hope to compare to it, a bold statement, but I absolutely stand by it. Killer 7 was a game that completely flipped the script on what games could do as an art form. You're gonna have a hard time finding a AAA title in this day and age that can be so self-compromising about its gameplay, in order to tell a surreal narrative that can somehow balance political intrigue, black humor, dogmatic trappings, and sheer horror through its untold circumstance. This was a game where Suda was at his height as a creator, and remains a divisive cult hate it is for good reason. It's not a game meant to be easily digested, but a game to leave you contemplating about. With that having been said, despite Killer 7 being the title that most embodies Suda51's nihilistic and anarchic tendencies as a director, with most people agreeing that it is his magnum opus, No More Heroes is the game that generally gets the credit for being the de facto Suda title for a mainstream audience, and it's not really hard to see why. It was a huge case of it being in the right place at the right time. For one thing, the game was much more of a, well, game than any of Suda's previous efforts, and it was also riding the high of the Wii at the time. After all, I mean, who didn't want a Wii game where you could go around swinging a lightsaber? In the broader context of, well, everything regarding the game, it's a double-edged sword in more ways than one, but we'll talk about the first one only for now. No More Heroes represents a divide in Suda's gamography. It was perhaps the most contemporary title he could ever put out at that time that could appeal to the masses, but its legacy was often credited to its aesthetic design, and I think that's really selling the story kind of short. Because the game's sequel, despite still featuring his involvement and said aesthetic, has a completely different feel to it. And I think it's fair to argue that misconstrued feel would eventually come to color everything in Suda51's subsequent output. In no way is that more evident than in the game that Suda would come to make after No More Heroes 2, which was Shadows of the Damned.
Okay, the best Resident Evil game that isn't actually Resident Evil.
While I really enjoyed Shadows of the Damned, well, the same can't be said about its developers. The original game was pitched as a survival horror game under the name Kurayami, and the game got a lot of traction because it was billing itself as an all-star team-up of Suda51, Shinji Mikami, and Akira Yamaoka. This was a dream project for Suda, but the game's publisher weren't having any of it. They were instead focused on wanting it to be digestible for a Western audience. And as such, it took several reworked, simplified pitches from the team at Grasshopper until the game finally settled on being a third-person action shooter based on a boy meets girl love story. Shinji Mikami pretty much admitted that they considered the game a personal disappointment for them, and that its development was especially heartbreaking for Suda, who had long dreamt of making a surreal horror game with Mikami, especially after their collaboration on Killer 7. Man, with all the executive meddling behind Shadows of the Damned, I hate to wonder who the publisher of the game was.
Oh.
All of this would essentially set the stage for the future. Suda is an auteur. He can write a story for a game, but if he's to properly capitalize on said vision, he needs to be the one steering the ship. Killer is Dead is arguably proof of it out of all of his games. While that game initially got some hype for its aesthetic comparisons with Killer 7, the game ends up becoming somewhat of an inconsistent mess because the direction of the game is constantly at odds with the narrative, and the story is primarily what he was credited for doing in that game. Suda would increasingly become less and less directly involved with the games he would make, and just about every game that followed Shadows of the Damned would be less about any surreal subtext, but more about the quirky aesthetics that Suda was no stranger to employing. And again, I enjoyed a lot of these games, but usually these quirky instances were meant to be in service of the subtext, where in future games it all just became text. And it's clear that at some point Suda became less a developer and more of a brand that publishers could slap on a trailer to gain niche audience appeal. All of which I think can partially be traced back to No More Heroes, since that's when most of the mainstream came to know of him. Much of his subsequent output has to live in the shadow of what No More Heroes put to the table. It was a hack and slash title that relied heavily on audacious presentation, which is usually the kind of games that Grasshopper would end up making after it came out. But like I just said earlier, the original No More Heroes is still of an entirely different breed in contrast to its sequel, and I think part of that has to do with the idiosyncrasies that someone like Suda brought to the table when he was a director working with somewhat of a humble team that could elevate his directive vision. No More Heroes is arguably my second favorite title that has come out of his ranks. Like many others, it is the first title from him I've experienced, and understanding why it became such a potent franchise that would be worth keeping around, you need to look no further than the elegance of the original, which never strayed from being a subversive killer package. Anyway, we've prolonged this segment quite enough, so let's dig deeper into the game itself. No More Heroes is about an average, down on his luck otaku who buys a beam katana and becomes an assassin because he wants to be number one and also impress a woman he wants to have sex with. Yeah, that's about it. On the surface, the plot of the story is ridiculously perfunctory. The idea here follows on Killer 7's concept of assassins and almost becomes somewhat of a parody of Suda's own tendency. In order for Travis to become the best, he needs to work his way up the ranks of assassins. There's a literal association of assassins that encourage infighting within their own ranks to rise to the top, as opposed to, how good you are at being an assassin.
We're both assassins, right? Why do we have to kill each other anyway? If you ask me, it's absolutely meaningless.
This is all very deliberate though, and assuming you figured out the central conceit that the game rests on, well then you'll have something to look forward to when we get back on that subject of the story in a bit. I mentioned No More Heroes was the most contemporary title Suda had ever put out at that point, and the gameplay is definitely the main reason as to why. Rather than being a puzzle first-person rail shooter action strategy piece of entertainment, No More Heroes is basically a hack and slash meets Grand Theft Auto. There are two phases to the game, the open world element and the ranked assassination missions. In the former, you'll be scouring the open world and taking on missions, upgrading your character, doing minigames, doing contract killings, and finding collectibles in service of making your character prepared and unlocking the next ranked assassination mission. Once you manage to make enough money to pay the Assassins Association, the second phase, namely those ranked battles, involve you going through a level and dispatching enemies before facing off with a colorful boss battle. The game's combat system is probably where most of the thought went into the gameplay element. I wouldn't call the combat system of this game deep, but it is a game that has a sort of dopamine-tingling snack food feel to it, and much of that is because of the novelty surrounding its controls. The developers are plentifully aware that many people will be in on this game for the sake of some motion control lightsaber action, and the game definitely provides on that to the maximum extent of still giving the player full control. Depending on how you tilt the Wiimote, you'll do high and low slashes with the A button. Slash away at an enemy, and when you've depleted their health, you can go in for the kill by swinging the Wiimote in a given direction in order to execute them. You can't swing around your little laser sword forever, so in order to recharge its juice, you're gonna have to collect battery pickups or, kill an enemy and you'll initiate slots which have a random chance to activate one of Travis's numerous dark side modes, where he'll yell out the name of one of his favorite anime characters, going into a superpowered state that can make him faster, shoot projectiles, or get a surge of murderous intent. The motion control elements aren't just limited to the combat segments though. The many side jobs you'll be taking usually involve some kind of gimmick or fun thing to do with the Wiimote, which are fun in the bite-sized packages they come in. In any normal game, they'd definitely be a lot more annoying to deal with considering their strengths, just like the combat, also come out about through novelty offered through the Wiimote. I mean, to be honest, without them, the point is kind of lost. With all that having been said, it's easy to take everything I've mentioned up until this point as being very thinly spread, and you definitely have a point. The minigames, for one thing, are sort of incongruous. Much of the game's general setup is a rinse-repeat, going through the motions. The overworld is somewhat perfunctory, because outside of exploratory hidden collectibles, you're only ever going between a couple of select locations. The overworld controls aren't the best, and it's definitely a game that has an element of a grind to it. For many reasons, this isn't necessarily the most elegant game when it comes to the structure of it all, and much like Killer 7, that can probably be owed to Grasshopper not being a big budget studio, especially during No More Heroes' development. That means that much like I postulated in my Killer 7 video, all of the gameplay elements, while definitely way more consistent than that game, is utilized partially as a vehicle for its narrative. That said, this is where things get tricky because No More Heroes is much more of a surface value game than Killer 7 was. It plays more towards appealing to a less niche base than a spiritual predecessor, and so the solution to this problem that Suda did is a neat little trick that you've probably already noticed considering all the building blocks that the game has set up by now, and as such contributes to the second factor, that aforementioned double-edged sword.
What do you say, bro? Join me. Let's see how far we can take this. And for you there holding the Wii remote right now, just press the A button. Let the bloodshed begin.
No More Heroes is a satire on video gaming. Not just on video games, but the culture thereof, the societal implications, and the mentality of people.
Do you like fighting?
Yep.
Do you like killing?
Live for it.
Do you like fear?
Can't say. Never felt it.
Do you accept death?
Death. Never crossed my mind.
So, let's talk about satire for a bit. It needs to be pointed out that satire is never a get-out-of-jail-free card. Like anything, it can be criticized, and that's because it needs a clarity in purpose and intent, since without that, it can easily be mistaken for that which it intends to criticize. This is why satire, or at least good satire, isn't just something like merely portraying a caricature. There needs to be a clear aim behind it, and subtext is everything. While satire can be humorous, the most important tenet of it is that it has to serve as commentary. Essentially, it's criticism of social constructs. Satirical media is a powerful thing, and that's why it's important to recognize the weight it carries, both the positive and negative. If the message or point presented is too ephemeral, then it can very easily be considered part of the problem, while something that beats its viewer over the head may come across as too preachy. In that sense, having to use satire as an excuse, specifically so in a self-compromising fashion, can easily be a flimsy leg to stand on. After all, I can admit that, yes, No More Heroes' overworld being barren and void is kind of the entire point, and plays into the game tying its gameplay loop into its larger narrative scope, but that doesn't necessarily make those elements more fun or enjoyable to play through, does it? So take everything I'm about to say in this half of the video with some reservation, and not so much as an excuse for the game's quality, but more so as an analysis of what the game ultimately tries doing to elevate its own experience.
Yeah, whatever.
Having said that, to No More Heroes' credit, there's never really one instance in the game where it tries to be self-congratulatory for what it essentially tries to be. Most of its satirical instances are usually built up in a way that rewards the player's investment in its characters. Because if there's one thing that drives this game's narrative, unlike Killer 7, it's definitely the personalities and characters.
That's not a good thing, you know. Seeking meaning in everything? Especially killing. That's a bad habit among smart little girls these days.
Travis Touchdown is the prime example of this. He's a character who embodies the worst traits of the kind of players who would gravitate towards a nerd fantasy like No More Heroes. He's a toxic masculinity figure who obsesses over fictional media, anime, wrestling, collects merchandise, is a chronic porn addict, has an extensive rain check of delayed rented films because his best friend runs a video store nearby and lets him get away with it, and his only motivation of getting off of his butt to do anything that requires agency is when he gets a hot new piece of equipment and wants to make it to the top so he can impress a lady who's clearly out of his league. It's good to have hobbies, but in his case, his life is his hobby. This is a guy that's less interested in an altruistic goal and more concerned about coming out on top, with his only morals being a cheesy code of honor that he likely adopted from watching some Super Sentai show. His goal is to be number one, and that's a really nebulous thing to establish, quite honestly. Here's a question that essentially pervades the experience of No More Heroes. Why do you play video games? Because when you get right down to it, Travis being number one is his idea of beating the game.
It's about determining who's best. That's what it's about.
And that's the game's show of hand. Travis is essentially a verbalized avatar, and he is literally living a video game. He's climbing up the ranks of a scoreboard. All of this is in service of a childlike fantasy he's essentially privileged to live through. His character and the world he lives in are clearly playing heavily off of tropes and parodies of popular media, the most notable one of which is Star Wars. It riffs on, parodies, and celebrates things like WWE, Pretty Cure, arcade shooters, and Travis's character himself is based on Johnny Knoxville. So with all that in mind, what does this amount to, and how does that draw back to the title of the game? Thing is, if you look at what the structure of the game itself is, it's kind of a surreal balancing act of what happens when a game tries to depict the joy of escapism juxtaposed with the mundanity of necessity. When you play a game, it's natural to do so with the intent of experiencing the best of what it has to offer. And most people will agree that the best parts of No More Heroes have to do with when you're doing the ranked assassination missions. But to even get to that part, Travis has to actually work to get himself in. This isn't something that's alien to boss rush style video games and is usually something of a necessity by virtue of its design. Games like Shadow of the Colossus did it before No More Heroes as well. I suppose if I'd have to give it a name, I'd call it the crescendo. It's the anticipation of it that gives weight to when you finally face down with the encounter. You spend hours imagining, envisioning what could possibly be waiting for you at the entrance to paradise. The difference is, in No More Heroes, it's very literal. The initial phase of getting through the daily routine and necessity, making enough money to essentially pay the fee required to enter into thrill-seeking conquest. Or if that was too subtle, the ranked battles are essentially video games and this guy is working day-to-day jobs so he can afford to buy his own entertainment.
Your entry fee? My overhead costs? Don't tell me that you were not expecting so many zeros on that price or that I am ripping you off or some shit. We have an elite staff in the thousands. Personally, I think it's a bargain.
Okay, I gotcha. But you really think I got that kind of dough on me? What the hell am I supposed to do?
You are supposed to do your job. You've been hired to kill someone, so just do it and quit your whining.
After working hard and finally earning the opportunity to indulge yourself, the satisfaction of getting to that location with that sweet tease of what you can expect.
Destroy man.
Come and get some.
And you're in the game. Beat the level, beat the boss, earn your kicks, back to the routine, life goes on. See you in the sequel.
It's just a job. The daily grind.
What makes these missions and by proxy the character of Travis such an interesting thing to dissect is how the title of the game works in more ways than one. While the title is obviously derived from the song by the Stranglers, Travis is a quintessential anti-hero who treats the world he lives in with reckless abandon, because from the start he's fully aware that this is all a game to him. It's his way of internalizing his task by living vicariously through shallow creeds and indulgent fantasy. And then the bosses start showing up, and that's when the game's title starts to become a lot more clear of a read. In the words of Rank 10,
"This is no paradise.
Alright, then what is it?
A place to die."
in every manner imaginable, the ranked assassins are essentially what you're playing the game for, and they're infinitely more interesting and developed characters than Travis are. They realize the ramifications of what they're involved in. They don't seem all too concerned with climbing the ranks, they're comfortable with where they are, and if anything, they'd rather get out of the game. Consider the fact that Travis is the only character in the entire game to be graced with the possibility to restart after dying, while no other assassin does, which explains why Travis doesn't actually fear dying, because he's the one lucky, or unlucky enough, out of all of them to be granted the persistence of a player controlling him.
You think you're hot shit. Who the fuck do you think you are?
And this kind of distinction of giving a loser character like Travis the lead protagonist role rather than someone more affable is something that the game has been fully aware of since day one. When the game was initially revealed under the name Heroes, the teaser trailer focused heavily on a handsome man who fought with swords and guns, someone very much designed with the protagonist's role in mind. But halfway into the trailer, he gets upstaged by a cloaked figure he thought he had defeated, who reveals himself as Travis, a cheesy amalgamation of American pop culture fanaticism, and it turns out that Travis was going to be the real protagonist of this game, rather than the guy who was initially implied to be the hero. Incidentally, that character, Helter Skelter, turns out to be rank 11 in the UAA, who Travis recounts defeating in the game's opening cinematic, and that notion of Travis seizing the intended hero role is something that sets the stage for the rest of the game. The fact that these characters are all depicted as hitmen can arguably be seen as something of a cheeky way of acknowledging video game characters as nothing but mere expendable commodities, things to be controlled and used for someone else's gain. They're the necessary ingredient that will be performing the tasks no one else is capable of doing, and they exist to be used and eventually discarded. Remember when I said in my Killer 7 video that the protagonist role in that game is just being a hired gun to do the government's dirty work? With these characters in No More Heroes, the same kind of thinking applies, but instead of them being depicted in the context of acting in service of a government, they're instead depicted as in service of a video game. Indeed, just about every character almost seem like they're fully aware that they exist in the game simply to die at the hands of Travis. Some of them reject it, some of them are impressed by it, some of them have resigned themselves to this fate, and some of them are so far gone by this metatextual notion that they've possibly even gone insane over it. Travis is essentially a glitch and assistant for what would have been a world with predefined characters and backstories. Would-be heroes, anti-villains, loose cannons, disgraced heroes, you name it. What sells the cast of characters that Travis goes up against in No More Heroes is that, ostensibly speaking, they're all written as if they were the protagonists of their own story. Just about every single character that Travis goes up against could very well serve as a flawed hero of a different game, or outside of the context that this particular game puts them in. Shinobu's probably the best example of this. While she's one of the few underage assassins, she attempts to separate her occupation from her day-to-day life. But the fact that Travis demands a confrontation with her, exposing her identity in front of her entire class, forces her to break the kayfabe. Because Travis shows up, Shinobu is forced to kill her entire class just so she can keep her identity a secret to the world. It's pretty much these disruptions in both action and dialogue that often make Travis a stark instance of the idea that sometimes patience is owed to these worlds and beings that the games like to provide. Why is your first instinct to tear through these characters and worlds that have their own stories to tell? This unremarkable open world, the binary objectives, the fact that exposition and detail only crops up within Travis's own points of interest is a way to show the game railroading him into a single-minded mentality, exploring why we partake in games. Oh, unless I don't find another opportunity to bring this up, this is probably exactly why Masafumi Takada's godlike soundtrack consists mostly of tracks that are variations and remixes of the main theme. The areas might be different, but the goal never changes. It's all rinse and repeat to push you forward. No More Heroes is something meant to be taken literally and figuratively. The goal you are presented in the game is a systematic destruction of barriers, characters, and worlds at the hand of a hungry player who sees a universe as a challenge to conquer and consume, rather than something to preserve, jumping from one obstacle to the next. Travis isn't a hero. I guess you can say he's grasshopper. Thank you, I'll be here all night. Dr. Peace is another pretty memorable assassin, if only because he has one of the few fleshed out backstories of all the characters that serves to highlight how remarkably flawed a bloodthirsty character like Travis would be if the game spared him any further thought beyond what his contradictory reactions are to his circumstances.
We dined at a fancy restaurant, one of those that are impossible to get a reservation for. And then afterwards, karaoke.
Who got you the reservation?
The association took care of it, of course.
Fuck. My entry fee.
And it arguably even hammers home the very notion that what Travis is paying for are essentially games that only serve to enable the very characters he wants to kill. Probably the only boss that's the exception to this rule is Let's Shake, but the game does something kind of interesting with him. This character shows up during the midway point of the game and is essentially the part where the player by now has probably had a good taste of the game's anarchic insanity. And Let's Shake is probably the one ranked assassin who breaks its own reliance on subtext by being an obnoxious, overabundant mess of design and capability. It's clear this game wants you to think that this boss is straight up impractical and ungraceful. He's a hideous design chop suey that the game spends too long obsessing about and building up. Until an unknown beam katana wielding rival who introduces himself as Henry shows up to dispatch him in one fell swoop, which the level itself even plays up as more interesting by making it a narrow hallway where you chase him. You're pretty much robbed from this fight, and you aren't allowed to fight Henry either, so while you advance in the ranks, this is the one battle in the game that sort of highlights why the ranking system and the satisfaction of it is so integral to its core.
Perhaps you've forgotten, these fights are an official game. If your opponent dies for whatever reason, according to the rules of conduct, it is your win.
That's fucked up! That's the stupidest rule I've ever heard! This guy's mine, and you just want me to let him go, bitch?
No one likes paying a lot of money just to get a medal of instant gratification. And incidentally, while I'm on that subject, I think this is kind of one of many things No More Heroes 2 got wrong. Because the progression of that game jumping around so much, being so incongruent and pulling the stunt more than once, just meant that the rankings had no reason whatsoever to exist. Again, in No More Heroes 1, Let's Shake existed in service of making a point about the game and its continued satire on video gaming as a whole. And hell, the game makes it up for you eventually by giving you that boss battle you've been craving against Henry later in the game. So in the end, you still get to fight 10 boss battles as advertised. To me, this is the essence of No More Heroes distilled to its core. Not necessarily the remarkable style, though it pays dividends and is a good reason as to why this series is so revered. But the fact that the style does mask an incredible amount of narrative substance that makes every subsequent event feel like a calculated execution that plays into its larger point. It's probably in lacking a lot of this that I didn't end up thinking of the game's sequel, No More Heroes 2, as equally potent, because unlike its predecessor, this was a much more straight-faced sequel about a straightforward revenge story that came to idealize its protagonist too much, when Travis is a character that works best when the game knows you're not supposed to idealize him. To put it in another way, if you want to contrast the biggest difference between the mentality of the two games, it's that in the original game, Travis's character and the twist behind his backstory is treated as a hilarious punchline to a terrible joke that he isn't even in on. Whereas in No More Heroes 2, a lot of these similar character instances are treated entirely in earnest to depict him as a much more likable hero character who goes through a traditional character arc. Which, well, I guess being conscious of the machinations of the game is a sensible way to do a sequel to a game that constantly poked fun of him debasing himself for it. And you could argue that the fact that he chooses to reject this fruitless manchild fantasy is what allows him to become more of that cool character that everyone always thinks of him as being. But at least to me, that shift in focus made Travis's character a little too predictable in the grand scheme of things. And it's a shift that's felt throughout a lot more of the game, including changes in mechanics and some of its now somewhat much less deliberate pacing. Because of that, No More Heroes 2 goes a little too wild in embracing the things that No More Heroes actively satirize, such as ridiculously impractical boss battles, the removal of the overworld, and entry fees making the game's crescendo feel inconsequential. Several ranked assassins getting shortchanged because the game prioritizes Travis's own character rather than the reactions he has to characters more interesting than he is. And overall, it's just a pretty surface level take of what made the original No More Heroes so iconic in the first place.
Shut up!
And don't get me wrong, it's not that I think No More Heroes' overworld and mission design couldn't use some refinement. Those elements aren't what I'd call good. The downtime grind between ranked fights could easily descend into becoming frustrating and grindy. In a quality of life sense, things like minigames and combat in No More Heroes 2 are better, even though the enemy and encounter design is so much worse. But this is all stuff that only really reads as better on paper, since a lot of its changes kind of feel like an instance of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Things like the open world and accessing ranked fights could have been refined to be made more palatable. And while not having many of its superfluous elements intact may work in service of No More Heroes 2's narrative, it's the sort of straightforward narrative that lacks the original's laser-sharp bite that felt unlike anything else on the market. It's definitely a much more mainstream take on the game, though I will give this game its due credit for a masterful soundtrack, some genuinely clever bosses, and for easily doing the emptiness of revenge story better than a certain other game that featured Robin not getting down with heads. By the way, I know this sounds overly negative, but I still really love No More Heroes 2. It's just that I'd often felt that the game's focus came about as a byproduct of what the writers essentially had to deal with when tasked to make a sequel to a game that pretty much closed the book on its own narrative.
Well, I guess you got a point there.
Which brings me back to No More Heroes 1 and its final boss. The ultimate payoff at the end of No More Heroes is the fact that there is no goal at the end of the rainbow Travis is following. If you already caught on to the heavy-handed metaphor of gating ranked fights behind money, then it should come as no surprise to you that the UA doesn't actually exist, and Sylvia is a con artist who has no intention of letting Travis get the touchdown on her. She only wanted to make money off of him. But he might as well finish what he started. So he heads to the first ranked battle, which is where things go belly up in a way that doesn't quite get to Metal Gear Solid 2's metatextual levels, but certainly provide an out for the game to cinch its grand message. Rank 1 shows up and, yep, he definitely looks like a final boss for sure. He squeezes in a Star Wars reference for good measure, but then goes into an abrupt retelling of Travis's backstory that he forgot about prior to the game. What the cynical outlook of the assassins prior to this encounter have informed Travis by calling him out for being full of himself is that he can't be a part of this game without having a healthy dose of baggage of his own. And despite Travis's insistence on rejecting any greater meaning, it's literally unavoidable for him to have a purpose when he's inside of the game. After all, what makes him so different from all the other assassins he's faced up until this point? As has been established, the main difference is the fact that there is a player controlling him on the other side of the screen. So the question is, did he simply forget because a player controlled him, or is it the fact that he, as the player, became a literal part of the game? It's pretty much the cruel irony of him transcending from becoming an avatar into becoming an actual video game character.
All assassins have fucked up somehow, or we wouldn't be in this profession.
And in Travis's case, it's actually quite a dark backstory. See, there's a photo frame throughout the entire game with a girl in it that is clearly at odds with everything else Travis keeps around in his house, and according to the game's manual, that's supposed to be Travis's ex-girlfriend, if you can believe it. It turns out the very reason he actually joined the UA wasn't to become number one, but because he drank himself to a stupor when he had found out that said girl had murdered Travis's parents and that he wants revenge. Which is why Sylvia set up the UA in the first place, for her to make money off of him and for him to get payback. And yeah, the actual final boss shows up and it's the girl, Jean. Then things get even weirder. The nonsensical twists keep piling up, but apparently they were half siblings and Yeah, somehow Travis just deals with it. You kill her and that's kind of it. Life goes on for Travis. Gets obvious karmic payback.
Can't a guy get some privacy? At least when he's taking a dump?
I'm afraid not. These fights don't work like that. It's time to die, Mr. First Rank.
You gotta be shitting me!
There's a lot that can be said about style over substance when it comes to video, unless you get to the real final ending and get that promised rematch with Henry, all in the motel parking lot in broad daylight while the best theme of the entire game plays, and look, I don't know, I just love this so much. This is probably the single most climactic, anticlimactic setting for a true final boss. At this point the ranked fights are over, and removing that context you finally get to realize how actually unceremonious this entire conflict really is. The twists just won't stop there. Henry reveals that he's actually Travis's twin brother and that Sylvia is his wife, and at this point Travis just gives up. All these twists of fate isn't what he signed up for, and is definitely not what the player signed up for. He's gonna have to deal with terrible conspiracies and twists until he finally finds a way out. Like every ranked assassin before him, he's tired and wants out of the game. So all that he can do now is to reject the game.
Wait a sec. You want me to tie up all these loose ends? I don't think so.
You're the protagonist. I'm just a cool, handsome foil who happens to be your twin brother. Hate to say it, but it's your job.
I want to bail, but where the hell's the exit?
Oh.
There's no way out, is there? No getting out, right, bro?
That's right. All we can do is keep running.
Then let's find that exit they call paradise. Let's go!
In applying so many tropes and parodies to situations with real consequence, the game lives and ends on this satirical dichotomy. And to close that book and drive that point home, it squeezes in one more parody in the face of what's meant to be a conclusive message.
I know. Too bad there won't be a sequel.
There's a lot that can be said about style over substance when it comes to video games, and Grasshopper are usually a developer that pride themselves wholeheartedly on their style. It's in their DNA. But the fleeting feeling of said style can only be maintained if you know fully well that the message and intent of the title is one that can resonate with people. And I think that's something Suda is absolutely conscious of whenever he's directing a title. Compared to a lot of the post No More Heroes titles that Grasshopper has put out, there's a good reason as to why titles like Killer 7 and No More Heroes were the ones that ended up becoming huge influences for games and creators with post-punk sensibilities. In my Killer 7 video, I described that game as a lightning in a bottle, and while No More Heroes isn't necessarily that, it is by all means still a magnificent success. If nothing else because this is still the game many people have in mind when they hear Suda51's name. So, honestly, with all that in mind, I think I'm a lot more excited about the prospect of Suda returning to direct Travis Strikes Again. I get excited about just anything he makes, but the fact that he specifically chose this franchise to make his grand return is really exciting to me. It doesn't have to be a necessarily big title. From a lot of accounts, it seems like it's a comparatively humble title to contrast Grasshopper's recent games. And I think that's a good thing, because it's similar sensibilities that brought about No More Heroes in the first place. The idea that Travis is this time literally tasked to dismantle video games compared to when he only did it figuratively is pretty much the freshest direction you can take the series that keeps Travis' purpose as a character grounded rather than deified, especially when the ranked assassin setup completely lost its thematic purpose for the sequel. Are these things that Suda can properly follow up on? Am I giving him a little too much credit? I don't know, it's possible. I'm a little worried, of course. It could go wrong. Maybe he's gotten rusty in the last decade. Maybe the games with his name on it actually are reflective of his current mentality. But a lot has changed since the original title and its sequel. Indies have become so much more prevalent, and I'm not surprised that Suda sees himself creatively more aligned with similar creators in the field. It'd be stupid of me to assume that he can deliver as impactful of a title as Killer 7 and the original No More Heroes. But I do believe he has it in him to provide a title that's at least resonant and purposeful in its intent. For better and for worse, No More Heroes' style inspired a wave of creators and publishers that would come to value Suda's name for his brand, while some saw through the cracks and saw the substance that lies within. And it's in that substance that No More Heroes remains to me and will always be a classic that stands as an expert satirical piece on video gaming as culture and lifestyle. It's ensured me that if Travis is still looking for that exit they call paradise, the search for that exit is definitely a ride I want to be along with for. Okay, so if I can just go off the script for a little while, I want to apologize sincerely for taking so long to put out a new video. There's been a lot of circumstances. If you follow me on Twitter, I've explained it a few times. I already mentioned that Ghastlycrate is a hobby, and it's not necessarily something I plan on to do full-time anytime soon, because at the end of the day, my biggest focus is on artwork and music and stuff. But I still really want to work on this channel. I have a lot of fun making these videos and analyzing games I like. So I wanted to do more videos during last year, but unfortunately my capture card broke, and that just screwed up a lot of scripts that I was working on, mostly console game related. And because of the fact that I mostly had so much work to do, freelance work, I do some music for games these days, and I finished another album last year, which you can check out in that link over there. I had to put the entire project on the back burner, and I hope to come back for it this year, but it might be another while until I put out another video like this. But we'll see. Hopefully I can put out some smaller videos in the meantime. But follow me on Twitter if you want some updates, and I'll be in touch with more Ghastlycrate in the near future. Thank you so much for your patience, guys, and see you soon.